why I started writing Naked in the Road. That's kind of a funny story. And so I was reading a story by Borges, and who's an amazing writer. And I was reading one of his stories, and then I suddenly thought to myself, I said, Jesus, Bear, you're such a useless bastard. You know, like the least you could do is write an email. Like all you can do is lay here like an idiot and read these stories written by someone else. I said, this is nonsense. You really should do something a little more active with your life. And so I got up and started writing Naked in the Road. And then I wrote, whatever, like 3,000 or 4,000 words or something when I first started it. And it was an idea I had a long time ago. And so it ends up being a novel because you get less active or whatever as you get older, I guess. But originally it was an idea I had. I thought it would be really interesting to, you pick this summer so you'd actually survive the experience, but it'd be really interesting to leave the house naked, and except you'd have to carry a sheaf of paper and a pen or something, plastic I guess, to wrap it in, and just start from zero and see how you do out there in the world. You know, it's not exactly zero because you have this whole series or set of skills, theoretically. And but I thought that would be a really interesting thing to do, and I thought, well, you know, I should do that. Well, right now I don't feel like it. Yeah, because it's not an easy thing to do, I guess. And so I had the idea already, and then when I thought I would write a book, well, not a book, sorry, it initially started as a story, and then I thought, yeah, I'll write that story, and see, and it's a logical progression, really. Like once you postulate someone who has left their house in the Canadian summer and naked, then it's very logical, the sequence of what's going to happen to them. And so they're going to, at first, be interested in food and clothing. And clothing is shelter. So, food and clothing. And so this character is, of course. And we don't really think much about the procurement of food, because it's something that's almost sort of automatic. You know, could you drop by the supermarket on the way home and pick up $40 worth of groceries? And but food is something we need a lot of, and it's constant, and not all that easily accessible. Like out here in the bush, there's only a limited amount of things you can eat. Like you wouldn't last very long eating out here, I don't think. And until you started killing animals, or you know, my neighbor, you could kill him and eat him. He's kind of old, stringy. And but if you're a meat eater, you know, like you'd start doing that or whatever. But even then, it's a bit of a grueling existence. So you plant food, and well, it takes food a while to come up. So this guy leaves, and he immediately goes to someone's garden. It's in late summer, and starts eating out of someone's garden, which we used to do as kids anyway. And because there's all this food just sort of laying around on top of the ground, and some of it very tasty. Cucumbers are always very tasty, eating out of people's gardens. And you could lay in between the rows. And so if they were looking down from their house, they couldn't actually see you, and you'd be laying in between the rows, like eating a cucumber. And they would come afterwards, and they would just find like these piles of shredded peels, you know? even without a knife. Carrots were a little trickier, because you pull a carrot up out of the ground, and sometimes they come out and they look almost clean. So they have a little bit of grit, and that's not a big deal. But a lot of the time they're dirty, and you wipe it on your clothes, and your clothes are kind of all covered in carrot. But be it how else you get it off. You don't want to eat this like weird muddy carrot and have a worm sticking to it. But you know, if you're hungry, that's what that guy does. And he steals a blanket from somebody's barn and carrots, and then he says, okay, here, you know, what are the range of options now? I have my blanket, and I've got food, so I can head off into the woods or I can live here on the fringes of society and eat there. And it's really almost the same narrative, unless you want to put in like kind of other intrusions of people coming in. So he decides to go off into the bush. But you're hard pressed, even in remote like New Brunswick, you're really hard pressed to get away from people entirely. I went on a trail back up in behind my property, which is way over there in the woods, and there's absolutely nothing out here like this giant. My land was clear cut 20 years ago, and now it's thick brush, and it's the same with the property next. And I was following this trail, and then suddenly there's a culvert, a washed out culvert, that's been there for years. And then up the way there's an old a hot water heater that's probably been there for 40 years, because people will take junk out in the bush and just dump it. So for the guy naked in the road, the culvert's not super useful, but the hot water heater would be very interesting. And I turned it over and took a good look at it and see if there was any wiring I could strip from it, or pieces, or whether there's any chunks of metal that might come in handy someday, and blah blah. And so that's what that guy would have done, and it's what he ends up doing. Of course, you can live very, very well on the fringes of our society. We throw away everything. It's amazing we make a device out of metal and then throw it in the trash. It's like you dug down a quarter of a mile into the ground to get the unprocessed metal, and now you're going to take the processed metal and throw it away. It's like, are you not thinking at all? Say, well, it's so easy to dig down a quarter of a mile. So depending on whether you're that energetic. But personally, I think I would probably use the one that I already had. Say, well, then melting it down. Say, no, just use it, whatever it is. Because none of this, you don't have to worry about melting it down. Lots of things can be reused. In New Brunswick, they don't recycle glass right now. So, which I'm glad they picked glass as their arbitrary option, because glass is inert. And glass bottles are excellent, and they will last for thousands of years. Long after the human species is gone, you'll find a ketchup bottle in the woods. The aliens will land and they'll pick up the ketchup bottles. So what could it possibly mean? Probably of religious significance. And so he goes off into the bush, and but his mind is filled with the garbage of our society. And in his particular case, it's filled also with the garbage of academe. And so it takes him a long time to root out what's real and useful from the stories and from the philosophy that he's been reading, and especially high English theory and that kind of thing, to root out what actually might be useful, and to start looking at the world around him like fairly freshly, and to realize that he's complicit in all these things that he complains about. He's a funny character that way, because he says, those people do this, and they are wasteful, and they do this. And really, he is part of this same structure. And he doesn't really get that until pretty late in the novel. And he's really divided himself from people who he's not really divided from. Like, he's chosen to divide himself from these people. And then late in the novel, he finds a whole community that has always been there, of people who were thinking differently. He took himself through some changes, and so he finds these other people. But he finds them after going through, ghost sequences and, investigation of the historical past in a way, I guess, and physical labor, and, a whole series of ways of sort of impinging on his nonsense. How would you describe that book? Would you describe it like that?
Word for word.
Exactly. That's how I think about that book. I'm still fairly pleased with that book. I wouldn't write it that way now, I don't think. And I do like this pompous, pedantic character. And I do like the portrayal of his pomp. And I think that... And I don't know that comes across, really, when people read it. I think they hear something else in him. like he's preachy and he's pedantic, and I think they read that fairly straight. They don't read it as a character, and the character having their own problems, and that we also have to sort through for ourselves. But a very interesting thing about that book, which is unlike any other book that I know about, is in people's reaction to it. People either like the first half or the second half. And I don't think I know anyone who likes both halves equally. They come down like on one end or the other. And that's really interesting. You know, are the first half and the second half so different? I guess they are, aren't they? There's that whole like bush part, and it tends to be people with a bush background, or people who grew up on farms, or people who understand work of hand. They really like the first half, and then the other people like will say like, oh, it just drug and drug and drug. It was so boring, and then finally, just all this description. It was so tedious, and then finally, like he starts meeting people and talking, and there's dialogue. And you're like, wow. Interesting. And then other people will say, yeah, it was a great book, as far as it went, but then it kind of like, you tacked on this whole last part, with the city, like I wasn't interested in that. And it's such a funny reaction to a book. And people they're a bit intent about that too. Like they don't feel casual about that assessment. And that's funny, and that's a fun thing about that book, I think, for me.